Hey guys, tonight we begin with the strange cravings of the medieval world. Not the grand feasts of royalty or the banquet halls of kings, but the quiet hunger of the common folk. The sort that whispers to you after dusk, when the chores are done and the fire has dimmed. This isn't a story about dinner, it's about the secret snacks of the forgotten. The street food, the sticky sweets, the fried things sold in shadowed corners. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're tuning in from. What time is it where you are? Across cobblestone lanes and crooked alleyways, food wasn't just survival. It was comfort, rebellion, and a small reminder that even in a world of cold stone and hard labor, pleasure still existed. A handful of roasted nuts, a wedge of cheese you didn't share, a fritter eaten while walking still warm. Tonight, we'll slip gently into that world. We'll follow the steam rising from old oil pots, hear the soft crunch of street pies bitten in silence, and visit the homes where cravings were answered not with luxury, but with a crumb, a sip, or a stolen bite. We won't name kings. We won't date battles. We'll sit instead beside the unnamed and the ordinary, the hungry, the tired, and the quietly delighted. Because history isn't just what was written. Sometimes it's what was eaten in the dark. And now, let's begin. Nightfall, in a medieval village, came softly, like a wool blanket draped over the world. Roofs exhaled warmth into the cooling air and hearths shrank to amber glows. One by one, shutters clapped closed, and door latches fell into place with quiet finality. The sun had slipped behind the trees hours ago, and now even the dogs slept, twitching in dreams, chasing smells only they could sense. By law, the streets should have been still. Curfew bells had rung, and fires were banked low. But hunger doesn't always respect curfews. Somewhere beneath a sloping thatch, a belly grumbled. Not the kind of hunger that brings pain, just a tug. A memory of warmth, a dream of taste. The supper had been too thin again. Turnip soup with more water than hope. Bread with a bitter edge. And that small ache, that gentle longing for more. Just something to hold the night, whispered through the silence. In loft beds and straw-stuffed corners, people shifted. A mother quietly reached beneath the sleeping form of her youngest to retrieve a cloth bundle. The last crust of the morning's bread. It was dry, but it gave the mouth something to do. Beside her, the fire popped, then fell still again. In another house, a boy sat up slowly, listening. The roof creaked. The wind teased the shutter, but no footsteps came. He tiptoed past his snoring uncle, eased open a cellar trapdoor, and dipped into the dark. He wasn't sure what he'd find. Maybe a shriveled apple, or the rind of cheese. That had been hiding behind the turnips. Even the smell was enough, earthy, cool, and slightly sweet. Some cravings, though, could not be answered indoors. A few lanterns stirred behind curtains. Dim flickers held low. Cloaks were pulled close, sandals tied tight. Doors unlatched with care, opening just wide enough for a body to slip out. No one said a word. They just moved, through narrow lanes and muddy paths, over stones worn smooth by centuries of feet. The town at night was a secret world, a different kind of village. No market callers, no clattering carts, just the soft rhythm of wind against wood. And the faint scent of something cooking. That was always the clue, the smell, oil. Maybe animal fat, maybe something older. Frying flour, onion, fish. It didn't drift, it called, like a rope of smoke pulling you forward. Around one bend, then another. Past the well, past the old inn with its shutters nailed shut. And there, under a sagging awning and a leaning beam, someone was still awake. A woman, perhaps, her hair tucked into a scarf, her face shadowed. Beside her, a low pan, bubbling faintly. She held a stick, stirring, lifting, turning. What was it? Dough, fish scrap? No one asked. It didn't matter. She wasn't a shopkeeper. She didn't bark prices or offer smiles. She sold to those who knew. A nod was enough, a glance. A coin slid across the cracked wooden sill. The food was small, always small, a fritter the size of a hand, a ball of lentils fried in mystery spices, a triangle of bread stuffed with something, soft and salty. And yet, it was enough. The heat seeped through cloth into fingers. The first bite scalded the tongue, but the second, that one, was soft. It filled the mouth with noise and nothingness all at once. Sometimes the person didn't, to even eat it there. They'd carry it home, warming their hands all the way. Other times they sat on the steps of a closed chapel, chewing slowly while watching the moon sneak behind the clouds. These weren't feasts. They weren't supposed to be. They were comfort, and they were shared. A mother tearing a fritter into thirds, giving the crispy edge to the one who'd been good. A grandfather tucking a sugared nut into his granddaughter's hand, pretending it came from his coat, not the vendor. The food had no name, no record, no recipe, just a smell, a pour, memory passed down like a lullaby, a fire gone out, a wrapper of cloth stained with oil, a whisper from the past saying, "We ate this back then, when we had nothing, but needed something." And just like that, the night grew still again. Footsteps retraced their quiet paths. Doors eased. Open and closed once more, the woman behind the pan poured water onto the fire. It hissed, then sighed. She wiped her hands on her apron, folded the cloth over her bowl, and vanished into the dark. No one thanked her. That wasn't the custom. But she knew. In the morning the world would remember its hunger, but not its cravings. Only night knew those. And that brings us to something a little hotter, a little riskier, and far more delicious. They didn't have signs, not real ones. No colorful banners or hanging menus. Just a smell and a shadow. Down. The narrowest alleys between buildings that leaned too close like gossiping old friends. There were figures, often hunched, always focused. They were the fry cooks of forgotten places. These weren't chefs, not even cooks in the usual sense. They didn't wear aprons embroidered with names or hats high enough to scrape the rafters. What they wore was time, smudged sleeves, cracked fingernails, burn marks on fingers that had forgotten how to flinch. Theirs was a labor of heat. They squatted beside stone basins and iron pots, their faces lit by oil flames and the dull shimmer of bubbling lard. Behind them, barrels of batter or chopped leftovers. In front of them, the future, brown and sizzling. They didn't need recipes, only rhythm, a handful of ground peas, a sprinkle of salt stolen from a cousin's table, a bit of old onion, a dash of dried mint if it could be spared. They knew how long to wait, not by clock but by ear. The sound of the oil told them, the change in bubbles, the hush before the hiss. Sometimes it was fish, but never the good kind, just tails and scraps pulled from baskets after the merchants left. Sometimes it was dough, stretched thin and flicked into the pan like a ribbon, fried until golden and curled like a smile. And always, always it was hot, so hot it misted the eyes and burned the tongue if you dared eat too fast. But that was part of the charm. The first bite hurt, the second soothed. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Children came first. Wide-eyed and barefoot, they brought tiny coins knotted into sleeves. They waited patiently, sometimes not so patiently, while their treat crisped at the edge. A fritter bigger than their hand, handed over with a grunt. Then the workers, men who had carried bricks all day. The women whose backs ached from scrubbing other people's laundry. They didn't talk much, just paid, nodded, and ate, still standing, as if to rest would betray how much they'd wanted this. No one stayed. Long. The alley was too tight, too smoky, but for a moment in the middle of its grime and grease it became a kind of chapel, a place of quiet reverence where craving met craft. The fry cook rarely looked up. They didn't need to. They heard the feet, felt the breath, sensed the hunger. They flipped and stirred and strained with the slow confidence of someone who had turned fire into food more times than they could count. Sometimes there were accidents, oil popping, fires flaring too high, a batter dropped too soon. No one complained. It was understood. This was not perfection, it was comfort. The smells clung to walls. Smoke curled into the hair of those passing by. The entire alley seemed to shimmer with heat and history, like it had always been frying something and always would, even when the cook left. because eventually they did, every night. When the batter was gone and the fire too tired to dance, the pot would be emptied, the oil strained into a jar for the next day, the bench wiped with a cloth dark from years of use, and then the alley would grow still again, as if it had never smelled of garlic or crisp dough or salted fish, as if the air hadn't just been alive with desire. But it had. And the people who passed through would remember. Not the face of the cook, not even the taste exactly, but the warmth, the bite, the brief joy. A memory left not in words, but in oil and air and the soft silence that follows satisfaction. And now from grease and grit, we turn towards something simpler, bread and beer, crusts and crumbs, the humble echoes of daily comfort. Some pleasures come not with a feast, but with a crumb, not with a roast on a spit or a pie oozing berries, but with something plain, dry and familiar, something you've had so many times you forget to call it delicious, until one quiet evening you do. The end of a long day brought no trumpet, no gold plates, just a bench by the fire and the slow settling of bones that had worked too long in cold air, fingers uncurled, feet ached in silence, and then the bread, not fresh, not soft. This was the crust, the heel, the hard edge, the part torn off, in the morning and left under a cloth until night. It was dense and dry, its edges flaking like old wood. But when held near the fire it softened, slightly, and that was enough. The teeth worked slowly, respectfully. The chew brought warmth and something else. Peace. Alongside it, a clay mug. Simple, brown, half-glazed. Inside, a drink not strong. Enough to numb, but not so weak as to feel thin. Beer, or something like it. Cloudy, bitter, with foam that fizzed just a little at the rim. It wasn't a party. It was a pause. Bread crusts and beer foam were the peasant's dessert. Not indulgent, but honest, the leftovers of the day, enjoyed when no one was watching. Sometimes they were shared, passed from hand to hand with nothing said. A grandfather sliding half a crust toward his grandson. A wife pressing a warm mug into her husband's palm, neither meeting the other's eyes, not out of shame, but out of a kind of reverence, because this was the real luxury. Stillness. There had been shouting earlier, at the well, at the stable, at the neighbor's fence that was suddenly 2 inches too close, but now in the fading light, the crust was all that mattered. And the foam. It tickled the lip, fizzled on the tongue, and left behind the ghost of barley. Children weren't always fans. The crust was tough, the drink sour. But even they in time would learn to love it, the way it filled the mouth and the moment. There was a rhythm to it, a sip, a chew, a sigh. The crust made no promises. It wasn't sweet, or fragrant, or filled with cheese. But it was there, always there. If the week was good, it came with a smear of lard or a dip in the soup pot. If not, it came alone. And still, it was enough. People called it poor food, man, but that wasn't the point. It was people food, the kind that warmed the hands just by holding it, the kind that reminded you that you had survived another day, that your hands still worked, that the fire still glowed. The beer was barely strong, but just strong enough to make you forget how cold the floor was, how thin the walls, and if you were lucky, just lucky enough, someone would say something funny, a quiet joke, a muttered curse at the wind, a memory from years ago that still made you smile, and you'd laugh. Not loud, just enough for the bread to crumble in your lap, and that crumb, that final crumb, would feel like a feast. Not all food had to surprise you. Some food simply stayed, stuck in your teeth, lingered in your breath, sat warmly in your belly until sleep came. Crusts and foam, the humblest of companions, the gentlest of fare. And now, from crumbs and clay mugs, we drift onward to something more indulgent, sweetmeats, folded in waxy paper, hidden in wooden boxes, waiting like secrets, behind stalls and under smiles. Some cravings are quiet, and others arrive with a shimmer, not loud, not brash, but bright, like sunlight caught in syrup or laughter trapped in a jar. These were the sweets of the medieval world, rare, precious, sometimes smuggled, always savored. Not everyone knew them, not everyone could afford them. But when they appeared, tucked into the corners of market stalls, folded inside wooden boxes, they were impossible to forget. Boxes, always boxes, made from polished wood or rough bark tied with twine. They held treasures, not by value, but by delight. Almonds rolled in honey, ginger boiled until soft, then dusted with sugar like snow. Sticky bits of fruit, shriveled and glistening, placed one by one on waxed paper. The children stared first, always. They pressed dirty fingers to the edge of the table. They leaned too close. Their breath fogged the lids. But the merchants, often older women with knowing eyes, didn't scold. They just smiled faintly, as if to say, "Not yet," because sweets were for later. They weren't meant for meals. They were moments, rewards, promises. A mother would buy just one candied fig, not two. One. She'd break it into 4 pieces, one for each child, and one for her, if there was any left. The taste was electric, not in a modern way, but in a way that tingled behind the eyes. That made people blink twice, unsure whether to swallow or chew. Sugar was rare and precious, imported at great cost, guarded like spice. But even the poor knew how to sweeten things. Honey boiled down until it cracked, apples dried until they darkened. Beet syrup, if you knew how, these weren't treats of excess. They were proof that joy existed, that celebration was possible, even here, even now. Children remembered the taste of their first sweet until they were old. It wasn't just the sugar, it was the way the woman wrapped it, the way the light struck it, the way the smell clung to their fingers all day. Long after the taste was gone, some people saved them, didn't eat them right away. They tucked the sweet into a cloth pouch, or slipped it under a pillow just to know it was there, just to hold the idea of sweetness a little longer. Sweets made people quiet, not because they were forbidden, but because they were sacred. Even the marketplace changed. When the wooden boxes were opened, the shouting softened, the air thickened with syrup and spice. You could hear the paper crinkle, the delicate snap of brittle sugar, and then nothing. Just the sound of someone somewhere holding their breath. Even grown men became children for a moment. They bit slowly, eyes distant. Their mouths slowed, their feet stilled. The world faded. A sweetmeat didn't fix the world. It didn't warm the house or mend a roof or stretch a coin, but it reminded people that the world had room for more than work. It reminded them that pleasure could be small and still be full. A peddler once came through town with a cart full of candied rose. Petals. Not many people bought them. They didn't trust the flower part, but one woman did. She said it reminded her of spring, back before her husband died. She didn't say more. She didn't need to. The peddler gave her an extra one and said nothing. Either because sweets weren't for talking, they were for holding, for tasting, for remembering. Long after the market closed and the shutters dropped and the lamps were snuffed, the sweetness lingered, on lips, on fingertips, on breath. A child dreamed of honey. An old man smiled in sleep. A merchant polished, her box readying it for morning. And just like that, the night carried the sugar away, leaving only the memory of a moment that was small and golden. Next, we'll follow the rattle of wheels and the whistle of carts. For the pies are coming. And with them warmth, mischief, and something wrapped in crust. The sound came first. A squeaky wheel, a soft whistle, a wooden rattle. Not urgent, not loud. Just enough to make you look up from your chores. Just enough to make a child dash to the door, wiping their hands. On their tunic, eyes wide. The pie man was coming. He wasn't famous, he didn't have a shop. Just a cart and a whistle and a face that always looked a little wind-chapped. His apron was stained, his boots dusty. But he brought with him the smell of comfort. Flour, fat, and something bubbling inside. The pies were never the same. Sometimes meat, sometimes fish. Sometimes a strange blend of turnip and spice that made no sense but somehow worked. Other times, if the gods were kind and the berries were in season, it was sweet. Each pie was a story, folded and crimped, crusted and browned, sometimes leaking at the corner as if it couldn't wait to be eaten. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The cart was announcement enough. People emerged from doorways with coins clutched in fists or tucked behind their ears. A copper here, a crumb of silver there. The pies weren't cheap, but they weren't unreachable either. They were somewhere between necessity and dream. He handed them over with calloused fingers, careful not to break the crust. He never rushed. That was the point. These were not meant to be devoured on the run, though many were. These were meant to be held, felt. The warmth seeped into the palms first, then the scent, then the bite, and oh, the bite. Thick, flaky edges. A steam that curled into your nose, a filling that dripped down your chin if you weren't careful. Some people burned their tongues every time, and every time they said it was worth it. The pies gave more than nourishment. They gave pause. Laborers leaned against walls, chewing slowly. Market wives sat on steps, wiping mouths between laughs. Children gnawed crusts as though they were solving riddles. No one asked where the pie man came from. He simply was. Like sunrise or mist. He'd vanish. For weeks, then return with a new cart. A new pan, a new limp maybe, but the same pies and the same quiet magic. Some said he baked them in the woods. Others swore he bought them from a widow 2 towns over. No one really knew. And no one wanted to, because the pie wasn't about the pie. It was about the moment it arrived. When the stomach growled and the sun dipped low and the day felt too long, then the pie came. Like a reward for surviving. People remembered certain pies like old songs. Do you remember the one with the duck and raisins? Someone might whisper. Or the one with leeks and cheese. They didn't write the recipes down. They couldn't. Because the taste changed with the season, the dough changed with the flour, and the filling changed with whatever was left in the pantry. But the feeling, that never changed. Holding that warm, flaky pocket of joy in your hand. Hearing the cartwheels vanish down the lane. Feeling full not just in your belly, but in your heart. That was the pieman's gift, and sometimes, if you were lucky, if the stars were out and the air was just cool enough, he'd whistle a tune, not loud, just under his breath. A little sad, a little sweet, like the pies. And you'd remember it. Later, long after the pie was gone, when the night grew cold and the dreams ran thin, you'd hum it, and somehow the flavor would come back to you. Not on your tongue, but somewhere deeper, somewhere soft. And as we walk, quietly away from the cart's fading wheels, we follow another scent. Something bubbling, something warm. Porridge, perhaps. Midnight porridge made not to impress, but to hold the body and hush the night. Midnight had a different texture in the medieval world. It was not full of neon or noise. It was thick, like a wool curtain drawn against the cold. It wrapped around roofs and chimneys and seeped under doors. It hushed the wind. It paused the world. And in that pause, someone stirred a pot. Not because guests had come, not because there was something to celebrate, but because the body still hungered and warmth was needed. Porridge, not a glamorous word, not a noble food, but perhaps the most honest. It began with water, or milk, if one was lucky. A bit of grain, whatever was left in the jar. Barley, oat, rye, each with its own stubborn spirit, dropped into a pot that had seen better years, over a fire barely awake, and slowly, gently, it thickened. This wasn't a feast. It wasn't meant to dazzle. It was meant to fill the quiet spaces. The ladle moved slowly. The pot whispered back, soft plops, gentle sighs. The scent rose like steam from a dream, simple, soft, promising nothing but heat and calm. It might be sweet, a chopped date if they had one, a spoon of honey scraped from the bottom of the jar, or a pinch of apple from yesterday's bruised fruit, now soft and warming. Or it might be savory, fat skimmed from the stew, stirred in with a handful of salt, a leaf or two of wilted herb, perhaps a crumble of cheese, stolen from a richer meal. But always it was thick, the kind of thick that sticks to a spoon long after you've finished, the kind that coats your ribs, they used to say. It was midnight's lullaby. Porridge wasn't served. It was held, in bowls cradled like babies, eaten, in silence. One scoop at a time, sometimes two people shared a bowl. Not because they wanted to, but because there was only one. They'd pass it back and forth, each trying not to scrape the bottom too loudly. It didn't need much chewing. That was part of its charm. The mouth could rest. The teeth could relax. The belly could be quieted slowly. No one made porridge for guests. It was too plain, too humble. But for family, for comfort, for nights when the cold got in through the bricks, it was perfect. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing. Only if it feels right. Some called it gruel. Others, mash. But no one insulted it, not really. Because porridge had saved them more times than they could count. When bread ran out. When meat was gone. When the mood was low and the snow was high. It could be eaten with a spoon, or with fingers, or just sipped, slowly, from the bowl itself. And when the bowl was empty, they scraped the sides with a thumb. Not out of greed, but out of respect. Nothing wasted. Nothing taken for granted. Even the leftover pot crust, the thin, chewy edge where the porridge met the metal, was considered a treat. The cook's reward. The child's favorite. And when the last bite was gone, the fire would be fed one final twig. The bowl wiped, the spoon rinsed, the room darkened once again, and inside their bellies the heat would linger. Not long, not forever, just long enough to carry them into sleep. In that sleep, they might dream of more lavish meals, of feasts and full platters and laughter echoing through great halls. But when they woke, if the fire had gone out and the wind returned, it would be porridge they made again, because porridge was what stayed. Through winters and grief and hunger and healing, through war and birth and nights without stars, just a bowl, a spoon, a fire and silence. From this thick warmth we journey next to something more distant and exotic. Tiny, fragrant miracles brought from far lands. Cloves, cinnamon and pepper, spices so powerful they could change a dish or a destiny. They smelled like faraway dreams. Before you saw them, before you tasted them, you could smell them, sharp, warm, oddly sweet. Say a scent that didn't belong to the village or the valley or even the country. Spices. They had no business being here. And yet, here they were. Tiny miracles packed into cloth pouches, crushed and scattered over dough, stirred into ale, hidden inside pies. Not often, not always. But just enough to make someone stop chewing and wonder, where had it come from? Who had carried it? And how far had it traveled to reach this bite? Cinnamon from Ceylon, cloves from Zanzibar, pepper from ships that crossed waters. Most people couldn't imagine. They weren't used in handfuls. Oh no, that would be madness. They were measured in pinches, in crumbs, in whispers. A merchant might sell you half a spoonful wrapped in parchment. Enough for a feast or a trick, because even the illusion of spice was powerful. Just one grind of pepper on a stew, and suddenly it became something else. Exotic, indulgent, almost holy. And yet, they were political too. Spices were symbols of power, of class, of reach. The rich used them carelessly, coating roasts and pouring them into wines. They believed it made them wise, cultured, untouchable. But in alleyways and crooked kitchens, the poor found their own ways. A single clove pressed into a loaf, a bay leaf borrowed from a garden wall, an old stick of cinnamon reused until it gave up the last of its soul. The taste was never precise, but it was enough to transport a moment. A fritter with a hint of cumin could become a memory of summer. A porridge spiked with black pepper might remind someone of a long-lost market stall. These were not recipes. They were spells, and the hands that used them, and they knew. They knew how to hide a bad smell beneath nutmeg, how to revive old meat with vinegar and herbs, how to make a feast out of what was barely edible. They didn't write it down. It was passed. Eye to eye, palm to palm, dusting bowls and fingertips, never tablecloths. Children noticed first. "Mum, what's that taste?" A smile. Something borrowed. The child didn't know from where, but they remembered. Years later, they would seek it again, chasing a flavor that lived more in memory than mouth. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Sometimes the spice arrived by accident. A fallen sack on a dock, a dropped vial, a generous monk, but once it landed it didn't last long, a pinch here, a crumble there, and then it was gone. But the memory lingered, and that was the real power of spice. It didn't last, but it stayed. It flavored not just the food, but the evening, the conversation, the silence that followed, and even after the plate was wiped clean, and the smell drifted out the window with the wind. The warmth clung to the tongue, a different kind of comfort, a different kind of indulgence, the kind that reminded you the world was wider than this room, that someone somewhere had picked a flower or crushed a seed, and now you, centuries later, worlds away, could taste it, in a crust, in a broth, in the final bite. And so the spice passed on, not as wealth but as story, wrapped in a fritter, whistled in a stew, held in the quiet reverence of a street cook who knew exactly how far this flavor had come, and how fast it would vanish. Now let us follow that warm trail to a brighter place. The street is alive again. Bells are ringing. Children are laughing. It is a feast day, and in the air, cheese, cakes, smoke, and celebration. There were days when the village glowed, not from sunlight and not from firelight either, but from the spirit that took hold when the calendar struck something sacred. A saint's day, a harvest fair. So a wedding that wouldn't be quiet. On those days the streets changed. Mud was swept, banners were tied, and something warm and golden rose in the air. The scent of frying. It was not everyday food. It didn't smell like thin soup or drying fish. This was indulgent, loud, fat sizzling on iron pans, sugar bubbling in wine, oil snapping like it had opinions. People didn't walk on feast days. They floated, drawn by the scent, by the color, by the promise that maybe, just maybe, this time, there would be enough, and usually just for that day, there was. Vendors who were quiet the rest of the month wheeled out carts stacked with flour. They cracked eggs into bowls the size of shields. They sliced apples so thin the sun passed through them, and always they fried. Fried cheese curds, salty and golden, oat cakes kissed with honey, dough coiled and twisted, then plunged into oil until it danced. Children clustered like birds. Eyes wide, mouths open, fingers pointing. There were rules, of course, coins exchanged, lines held. But sometimes a child too young or a grandmother too tired was passed something warm without asking. Just a nod, just a smile, just this once. Feast. Days forgave things. They forgot who owed what. They let the poor pretend, they let the hungry eat, not much, but enough. And the food. Oh, the food, it glistened. Wine-soaked pears spiced with clove. Puffballs of dough rolled in sugar that stuck to the corners of mouths. Pastries filled with cheese or onion or crushed nuts. And in every bite, laughter. Because this food wasn't just for the belly. It was for the spirit. It made people tilt their heads back and laugh, eyes closed, as if they could float. As if they didn't have to return to work tomorrow. As if the world was made of flavor and kindness and song. And sometimes there were songs. A fiddler with 3 strings and a bucket for rhythm. A voice lifted too high, cracking but brave. The friars didn't sing. Their hands were too busy. But their movements had rhythm, crack, flip, toss, plate. They didn't look up much. But they smiled quietly. Especially when someone took that first bite and their eyebrows rose in surprise. Because that was the goal. Not perfection, not polish, but delight. To make someone stop, mid-word, and close their eyes. To make a father share his last bite with a child. To make a stranger buy a second helping just to hand it to someone else. Even the air felt different, heavy with salt, sweet with sugar, bright with the sharp edge of vinegar and mustard. Feast food didn't last. By sunset, most of it was gone. By midnight, only the crumbs remained, but it left behind something softer. Memories, grease on fingers, warmth in the stomach, and the quiet promise that it would happen again. Not soon, but someday. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing, only if it feels right. The feast wasn't for kings, it was for the tired, the aching, the unnoticed, for the woman who cleaned church steps all year. For the man who hadn't smiled since harvest failed, for the children too small to carry water, but big enough to dance in circles. And in the brief brightness of the day, they all became something more, not because of music or banners, but because food fried sweet shared gone too soon, but never truly forgotten. And when the last oil hissed and the fire died low, the vendors packed up. Quiet again, gentle. They washed their hands in wooden basins and wiped sweat from their brows with sleeves they'd worn since morning, and they went home, not rich, not famous, but knowing they'd done something holy. Now let us follow the wine, fermented, warmed, spiced and strange, because for many, sweetness came not in crust or cake, but in the bottom of a cup. Not all sweetness came from a crust. Sometimes it came in liquid form, swirling in a wooden cup, amber in the firelight, sticky at the rim. Mead, a drink made from honey, thyme, and a little risk. It wasn't poured from barrels marked with dates or aged in deep, quiet cellars. It was brewed in corners, in basins behind hearths, in clay pots with loose lids and whispered prayers that the fermentation would work this time. And when it did, the village smiled a little more that night. It was thick, slightly cloudy. It didn't bubble like ale, it shimmered. The first sip hit the tongue with warmth. The second, well, that one wasn't remembered clearly. Sweet drinks were strange gifts. They didn't fill the belly. They didn't last long. But they changed things. They changed how people sat beside each other, how they told stories, how they laughed, laughter that grew too loud, then softened into nothing. A silence between two friends who didn't need words, a whispered confession in the dark. The mead didn't cause those things, but it allowed them, and it wasn't just mead. There was spiced wine, warmed over fires and stirred with sticks of cinnamon. There was fermented berry juice, sharp and wild. There was cider that tasted like autumn and patience. Each cup was different. Each night unpredictable, because sweetness doesn't always mean safety. Sometimes it means forgetting. People drank to remember, and people drank to forget. And sometimes they did both at the same time. A mother remembered her wedding day as the honey hit her lips. A farmer forgot the frost that killed his crop as the cup emptied. A boy took his first sip and thought it tasted like bees and wood smoke. He would never forget it. The drinks were shared, passed in circles, poured from vessels chipped and worn, but loved. The fire crackled, the shadows danced, the night lengthened, voices rose then slurred, songs began then collapsed into laughter. But the sweetness stayed, even as the cups ran dry, even as the first drops of dawn crept across the window pane. Not all drinks ended in joy. Sometimes there were tears. Sometimes someone stumbled too far. Sometimes silence became heavy instead of soft, but even then the mead was not to blame. It was a mirror, a window, a key, and sometimes a door. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below, and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. The morning after was always quiet. Mugs left unwashed, a stool knocked over, someone still asleep on the floor. The air smelled like wood smoke, spilled sugar, and the faint regret of stories told too easily. But there was no shame in it, because sweet drink was a gift. And gifts are not always gentle. Some nights it brought joy, some nights mischief, some nights madness, but every night it brought something else too. Connection, a shared warmth, a shared weakness, a shared memory. And in a world where days were long and food was scarce and life rarely offered softness, those moments mattered. They lingered, like the honey at the bottom of the cup. Now let us step away from the fireside and into quieter. Halls, stone corridors, candlelit kitchens, where monks walk barefoot and secrets rise with steam. For even in silence, sweets found a way. Behind high stone walls and under the hush of a vow, there was butter. Not a lot, not often, but enough to spread quietly across a warm slice of bread before morning prayers. Monasteries weren't built for indulgence. They were meant for discipline, for ritual and silence, for clean hands and empty bellies. And yet, even here, sweetness found its way in. Perhaps it snuck through the garden gate, a fig from the orchard, ripe and drooping, A sprig of mint hidden beneath the cabbage, or perhaps it arrived in sacks, flour from the town, a few knobs of cheese too soft to sell, and in the small stone kitchens where no one spoke above a whisper, hands worked miracles. There were fritters, laced with herbs, not fried in abundance but turned once in shallow fat until golden, a scent that softened even the sternest face. There were cakes, not frosted but dense and sweet, made with apples or dried plums, shared in slices so thin they curled. A monk might pretend he wasn't waiting for his, that he had forgotten which day they baked. But when the bell rang for the midday meal, he walked a little faster. Even austerity has its comforts. Butter, when permitted, was portioned with reverence. Spread with a wooden knife, never wasted. It clung to crusts and pooled in corners. And always there was bread. Fresh, still warm, not all the time, perhaps only once a week. But it was enough to make the corridors smell like forgiveness. The youngest monks stole glances at the ovens, not out of greed, but out of hope. The smell wrapped around them like a memory from before the monastery. A childhood kitchen, a festival, a market long vanished, and when no one was looking, a crumb might be pinched and placed on the tongue like a prayer, because sometimes prayer tasted like salt and dough. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing, only if it feels right. The abbots knew, of course, they weren't blind, but indulgence, when humble, is not sin. It is gratitude for sunlight on the floor. For cheese that didn't spoil. For a mouthful of sweetness that makes silence easier. Some monks brewed their own ale, mild, dark, spiced with rosemary. They called it a tonic, and perhaps it was. It warmed the chest and loosened the tongue, if only for an evening. In winter, pots of gruel were thickened with honey. In spring, herbs were tossed into batter like poetry, and on feast days, rare but sacred, the kitchens worked early. Pans clattered, firewood snapped, and trays emerged. Holding pastries shaped like doves or fish or stars, they were eaten slowly, as if speed would erase the blessing. No one spoke of the food, not directly, but the silence that followed each bite was a kind of reverence. And when the plates were scraped clean and the crumbs brushed into waiting palms, the monks returned to prayer, not emptier, but fuller. Because even in a life stripped of luxury, the body remembers sweetness. It remembers warmth, and it thanks the hands that gave it. Now we step from the cloistered quiet into the tiled floor of another kind of healer, where sweetness came wrapped not in cloth but in remedy, where sugar met sickness and pleasure became medicine. In the still corners of crooked streets, behind doors that smelled of dried herbs and warm wood, there lived a strange kind of sweetness, not sold by bakers, not fried in pans, but measured by spoons wrapped in parchment and whispered to the ill as a cure. This was the apothecary's sweetness, boiled, stirred, preserved, and it came with instructions. Take one before bed. Let it melt slowly. Do not chew. And only two, never three. But deep down, and everyone knew, this was candy disguised as care. On polished shelves stood jars filled with jewel-colored drops, sugar stiffened into small miracles, spheres of candied fennel, slabs of honeycomb hardened into lozenges, strips of licorice black as ink and bitter enough to bite, but still somehow beloved. The apothecary wore robes, a wise face, ink-stained fingers. He spoke of digestion and phlegm, of warming the humors and calming the bile. But the children didn't hear any of that. They only saw the glass jars and the spoons. Even the sick smiled, just a little, because medicine that tasted sweet felt like a secret, a loophole in the world's constant harshness. The sugar was boiled, in small copper pans, stirred with patience, then poured onto cool stone where it hissed and cooled into shapes, buttons, sticks, coins, sometimes wrapped in waxed cloth, sometimes rolled in herbs, a minty bowl for the breath, a clove lump for toothache, a ginger square for the belly, and sometimes one for no reason. The apothecary wouldn't say it aloud, but he knew. He saw the widow who came even when she wasn't coughing. He saw the boy with no bruises who asked for something to help him sleep. And he always found something, because healing wasn't always about sickness. Sometimes it was about sweetness, about a moment held on the tongue, a pause from pain, a reminder that not everything in life was sharp or cold. The shop smelled like chamomile and vinegar, but behind the counter it smelled like joy. The tins were dented, the labels faded, but inside, peace, a sweet made slowly, by hand, for someone who needed it. No one rushed. The buying, the chewing, the swallowing, it was all part of the ritual. Even adults cupped the candy like a blessing, one drop, held against the roof of the mouth. Let it melt, let it linger, let it do whatever it was supposed to do. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Some claimed these sweets had magic, that the licorice stick kept away fever, that the sugar clove ball made dreams sweeter, that the violet paste could mend a broken heart, and perhaps in a way they did, not because of the ingredients, but because of the gesture. Someone had made something just for comfort, not to fill the stomach, but to soothe the soul that mattered. In a world where most things were taken quickly, food, money, breath, a sweet that lasted, slowly dissolving, was a kind of resistance, a small rebellion against bitterness. And as night fell over the town, and the shutters closed, a little girl might fall asleep with the taste of sugar mint still on her tongue, and dream of nothing in particular, just warmth. And that brings us to a colder corner of this journey. A winter lane. A crackling brazier. A paper cone filled with something hot, something roasted, something shared. Chestnuts, brown as bark, sweet as wood smoke. Winter had no mercy. It crept through the seams of walls. It rattled shutters and froze buckets where water once lived. It turned bread to stone and fingers to ice, and yet on some street corners in the grip of that long cold, warmth flickered, not from a grand hearth, not from wealth, but from a brazier. A metal drum, black with soot and alive, with crackling heat, and over it, chestnuts, roasting, splitting, darkening. The smell drifted like hope, nutty, smoky, a little sweet, like the memory of something better. Vendors wore layers, blankets as coats, mittens stitched from old socks. Their faces were red with wind, but their hands hovered over the coals, turning the chestnuts with iron tongs. They didn't shout. There was no need. The scent did all the calling. Children came first, always, with coins in mittened fists or just wide eyes and shivering shoulders. Some bought, some begged, some waited for generosity, and often, softly, wordlessly, they were handed a cone, a twist of paper, old and yellowed, folded into a pouch that held heat like a secret. Inside, 6, maybe 8 chestnuts. Enough. They burned the fingers at first. Steam hissed from the cracks, but soon the shells were peeled back, carefully, reverently, revealing golden brown softness. Each bite was small, satisfying not because of sweetness, but because of warmth. They tasted of earth, of trees, of fire, and for a moment, of comfort. Mothers bought them for silence, a treat to keep a child calm in the long line for grain. Old men bought them for memory, of younger winters, of hands that once held theirs, and the rest bought them, just to feel something warm. In a season that took so much away, color, ease, sleep, a cone of roasted chestnuts gave something back. No one ate them fast. They weren't that kind of snack. They were meant to be savored, felt in the fingers, peeled in the lap, eaten slowly, so the moment stretched just a little longer. Even the smell lingered, on scarves, in sleeves, in the folds of a cloak. Later that night, back in cold beds under heavier blankets, children would press their noses to their sleeves and smile, because the smell was still there, proof that they'd had something good, something warm. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing. Only. If it feels right, chestnuts weren't luxurious, they weren't rare. But in winter they were magic, they didn't sparkle. They didn't sing, they just glowed. Brown and blistered, burnt at the edges perfect. Vendors packed up with stiff fingers, ashes swept, tongs cooled. Tomorrow the brazier would return, the coals would burn, but tonight the air still carried the echo of warmth. And across the town, in every pocket of quiet, Someone was remembering a small fire and a handful of roasted gold. From here we turn to something stronger, sharper, a cheese cut with a knife that wobbles, a bite taken behind a stall with no napkin, no shame. Savory, silent, and just a little rebellious. Some foods whisper. Cheese. Never needed to. In the markets of the medieval world it sat quietly, wrapped in cloth or left bare on wooden boards. No signs, no fanfare. Just a block of salt, time, and air. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't new, but it was there. Always there. Sold in wedges, hacked with a knife not sharp enough for the job, carried in satchels that had held onions the day before, hidden in the folds of a vendor's apron, pungent, familiar, indispensable. It didn't call out like the fried pies. It didn't shine like roasted nuts. It simply waited, and the people came. They didn't ask, what kind is it? They knew it was cheese. Whatever had survived the cellar, whatever had firmed in the barn loft, over winter. Whatever the cow or the goat or the sheep had given 3 moons ago, some soft, some hard, some chalky, some dense with holes, but always cheese. It had a way of holding the tongue, sitting just behind the teeth like a thought you didn't say aloud. Boy might buy a piece on his way to the mill, too young to be alone, too proud to ask for sweets. A woman might keep a sliver in her sleeve, hidden from her husband, savored in secret during the quiet hour between chores and dusk. It was a food, of hiding, not shame, just privacy. The way people closed their eyes during a hymn, the way they tucked keepsakes in the bottom hem of their cloaks. Street cheese was that kind of comfort. When unwrapped, it greeted the world with scent before taste. Some batches were sour, others nutty. A few so ripe they stung the air. But no, one complained. They knew what they were buying. They knew the flavor would outlast the moment, that it would cling to their fingers until nightfall, that it would linger in the gap between teeth until the next meal. And they welcomed it, because this wasn't food for display. It was food for survival, for silence, for sharing when you couldn't afford to. A father might break a piece in 2. Give the smaller half to himself. Pretend he wasn't hungry. A stranger might see someone shivering near the bread stall and place a corner of their wedge into the cold hand, walking away before words could ruin it. The transaction was often wordless. A coin, a slice, a nod, but meaning swirled between them, because to give cheese was to give strength, and to eat it, alone beside a river, under a sky grey with waiting rain, was to remember that the body still mattered, that the world hadn't taken everything. The cheese vendor didn't smile much. They didn't need to. Their hands were busy slicing, wrapping, watching. They knew that their table, simple, quiet, smudged with wax, held something sacred, not in the holy sense, in the human sense, the part of us that doesn't crave luxury, only enough. And this was enough. Even the children grew to love it, not immediately, not the way they loved sweets or pies, but slowly, the way they learned to love the smell of their father's coat, the creak of the front door in wind, the sound of bread crust snapping between teeth. It became memory, muscle memory, seasoned into them with each bite. Even when they left the village, if they ever did, they'd remember, not the name of the cheese, there were no names, but the way it broke apart, the way it warmed in the hand, the way it felt honest, because in a world that often asked too much, street cheese asked for nothing. No attention, no performance, no thanks. It only asked to be eaten, and it gave more than it cost. Now from this quiet saltiness, we turn toward desire, shaped in dough, fried in shallow oil, folded with longing, drizzled in sweetness, passed from hand to hand like a secret wish. Desire isn't always loud. Sometimes it sizzles quietly in a shallow pan. It smells like flour and smoke, like oil that's been used one too many times, like something simple turned beautiful by heat and hunger. In the medieval street, desire often wore a thin coat of dough. It came, folded, twisted, stretched thin with fingers that worked quickly. The vendors didn't speak much. Their language was motion, scoop, stretch, flick, fry. And just like that, desire became edible. Flatbreads cooked on hot stones, pancakes with uneven edges, flipped by instinct. Fritters with something, anything, tucked inside. Leeks, herbs, yesterday's mashed peas. It didn't matter. What mattered was the bite, the crunch at the edge, the softness in the middle, the way it steamed when torn open, scent rushing out like a secret told too quickly. People waited for it. Lined up without truly lining up. They knew who came first, they knew how to wait. Coins changed hands, so did glances. And when the food arrived, still too hot to hold, they smiled. This wasn't luxury. It wasn't even sustenance. It was something else, something closer to longing. Because dough, when fried, becomes more than dough. It becomes an answer to boredom, to bitterness, to days that stretch too long and nights that offer too little. Some ate it plain. Others dipped it in vinegar, sharp enough to jolt the tongue. A few drizzled honey on top, if they were lucky. Each bite had its own rhythm. Some chewed, fast stealing warmth before it vanished. Others slow, eyes closed, feet stopped in the middle of the road. Vendors knew who would savor and who would run. They made enough for both. No two pieces looked the same. Some puffed like pillows. Some curled like ribbons. Some flattened into crisp moons that broke with a whisper. But all were eaten the same way, with reverence disguised as casual hunger. Fried dough had no rules. It was eaten standing up, walking, sitting on steps, in markets, in fields, on bridges. Once a widow bought two, one for her, one for the bench beside her. She didn't say why. No one asked. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Dough was cheap, oil was not. So each piece fried was a kind of gamble, a prayer that the flame would hold, the batter wouldn't stick, the rain wouldn't come. And when it worked, when the piece puffed and browned just right, it felt like magic. Children begged for scraps. Teens stole corners. Lovers shared edges, biting from opposite ends until their noses met. Desire. Again. Innocent. Sticky. Always warm. Even the ashes smelled good. At night, when the vendors packed their cloths and poured water on the coals, the scent still lingered in the street, in doorways, in hair, in memory. People dreamed of it, not of the shape or the flavor, but of the feeling, the moment it touched their tongue, the moment everything felt okay, for a heartbeat, for a bite. And that was enough. Now let us descend into brine, to jars buried deep in cellars, to tangy distractions, sour crunches, and comfort with a vinegar bite, pickled things, sharp, cold, honest. Not all comfort is warm. Sometimes it's sharp, cold, sour, tangy enough to make your jaw ache in the best way. In the medieval world, comfort often came from jars. Not polished glass like today, but rough pottery sealed with cloth heavy with time. Jars buried in earth, jars stored beneath floorboards, jars tucked behind sacks of grain like secrets too strong to spoil. Pickles. They were not luxuries. They were survival, but also quiet indulgence. A wedge of turnip soaked in vinegar and cloves, a curl of cabbage still crisp beneath the brine, a strip of cucumber, salted, sour, softened just enough to chew slowly in thought. There was a pleasure in the sting. It reminded you that your tongue was still alive, that even in the coldest months, when everything else dulled, taste could still surprise you. People didn't eat pickles for fullness. They ate them for feeling. That rush behind the ears, the shiver that ran up the spine, the slow blink after the first bite. It was not a feast, but it was something. Something that cut through bland porridge, something that sharpened tired soup, something that made black bread feel like more. Households had their own recipes, passed from grandmother to granddaughter. A pinch of this. Bit more salt. Always too much vinegar, never quite enough time. They'd fill crocks at summer's end, seal them for winter, and wait. By the time frost blanketed the windows, the pickles were ready. And oh, how they were needed. When the stew grew thin, when the meat ran out, when everything tasted like smoke and ash, that's when the pickled onions were unwrapped, white and sharp, soft and strong. They burned just enough to wake you up. Children winced at the first taste, but reached for more. Adults didn't wince. They simply nodded, quietly approving the bite. Vendors sold them too, not in great bowls or golden baskets, but from barrels, dark with brine. They'd fish out slices with their fingers, lay them on bits of paper. Cheap, portable, perfect. A snack that needed no heat, no prep, no ceremony, just teeth and patience. Sometimes they were sweet, pickled pears or apples, softened into size. Other times, sour to the bone. Radishes that snapped, garlic that bit back. But always comforting. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Because in a world of scarcity, pickled things were proof that people planned, that someone thought ahead, that the hunger of February had been considered and faced and answered, not grandly, not boldly, but with jars and salt and time. Pickles outlasted arguments. A couple could go days without speaking, but they'd still share from the same jar. One fork, two bites, a nod across the room. Peace preserved in vinegar. Some called them peasant food, but those people didn't understand. Pickles weren't poor. They were wise. They held flavor when nothing else did, and they gave joy when the sun had disappeared for too many days. The best ones were hidden, tucked under beds. Carried in pouches, eaten in corners. A soldier might unwrap one before a long march. A mother might chew one slowly in silence after her children slept. A child might sneak one, leave the lid crooked, and pretend it had always been that way. No, one scolded, because everyone knew what that bite meant. A spark, a whisper of life, a sour little reminder that there was still something to feel, even when everything else was numb. Even when the nights grew long and the fires too low and the world asked too much. Pickled comforts didn't fix the world, but they made it bearable. They reminded you to chew, to breathe, to taste, and that was enough. Now let us follow the sound of shells cracking, seeds rattling in wooden bowls, and something roasted just enough to be remembered. For not all treasures were sweet or salty. Some came in shells, hidden, hoarded, nut by nut, seed by seed. Some treasures didn't glitter. They didn't shine in candlelight or sit in the pockets of noblemen. They rattled, in cloth pouches, in hollow wooden bowls, in the bottom of drawers, wrapped in fabric that smelled faintly of smoke and mint, nuts and seeds, hard to crack, easy to love. They were small, sometimes bitter, sometimes soft, always satisfying in ways no stew could replicate. In the medieval world, they were snack and secret. They traveled with soldiers, nestled in saddlebags beside flints and spoons. They hid in the corners of pantries, tucked behind pickles and preserves. They were hoarded, quietly, carefully, because they lasted, through frost, through famine, through forgetfulness. A handful of roasted hazelnuts could keep a worker upright long past noon. A pocketful of almonds could be slowly nibbled across a long walk home, each one cracked open with a satisfying snap. If you had the teeth for it, or the stone, or the patience. And inside, dense, rich, a little sweet. Enough to keep going, roasted in ashes, toasted in pans, sometimes dusted with salt or honey, or left plain as they were. Seeds were different, lighter, slipperier. They danced on the tongue and lodged in the teeth, poppy seeds, sesame, flax sprinkled on flatbread, mixed into dough, licked from fingers when spilled. Children loved the sound of them, the rattle in a pouch, the scatter on a tray. They felt like toys. They tasted like mischief. But they mattered. They were currency, in a way. Not for trade, but for trust. A neighbor might offer you a palmful during a long conversation. A lover might press a few into your hand on the way to a goodbye. It was a gesture, a gift, a kind of edible poem. And always they were stored, hidden in jars behind the salt, buried in grain bins, sewn into hems, because you never knew when you'd need them, not just for hunger, but for joy. For the moment, the day felt too grey, too heavy, too still. That's when you reached for your hoard. Not much, just a few, enough to remember the sound, the crunch, the comfort. Even the act of eating was a ritual. Crack, peel, eat. Crack, peel, Eat, like prayer. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Some people ate them under trees, others by candlelight. Some stole them from baskets they weren't supposed to touch, and some gave them away with a shy smile and no explanation. Because food this small didn't need one. It spoke for itself, tiny but powerful, not enough to fill the belly but enough to remind the spirit that there was still sweetness, still salt, still something left. In winter they were hope, in summer celebration, during fasts exceptions, during sadness salves. People remembered their first almonds more than they remembered their first kiss, because almonds came with scent, with texture, with surprise, the way they crumbled, the way they held flavor, the way they refused to spoil, and even the shells had their beauty, stained, spotted, cracked just right, left behind on benches, in corners, under beds, the evidence of pleasure. Nuts and seeds were small, yes, but they were a luxury the poor could sometimes reach, not often, not enough, but sometimes, and when they did, oh, they cherished it, they didn't waste a single one. Even the broken bits were swept up. Even the skins were tasted, and when the last one was gone, the pouch was held a moment longer, just to feel what it had once contained. Now let us wander toward the shadows, toward mischief, toward hunger that breaks rules, steals apples, and eats, in alleyways, where food tastes better because it isn't allowed. Some bites are sweeter when they're not yours. In the medieval world, hunger was not always patient. It knocked softly, then loudly, then clawed its way in. And sometimes the answer wasn't charity. It was theft, small, silent theft. A crust from a windowsill, a wedge of cheese left too close to the ledge, an apple nicked from the edge of the stall when the seller turned to cough. These weren't crimes for gold. They were crimes for taste, for salt, for sugar, for the feeling of something when life gave nothing. Children were the boldest. They had the smallest hands, the lightest steps. They didn't call it stealing. They called it finding. A plum that fell, a roll that wasn't being watched. It didn't feel like sin, it felt like survival, and the bites were quick. Stolen food was never eaten slowly. It was devoured, half in fear, half in joy. And oh, the joy, the first crunch of an apple, the burn of mustard on the back of the tongue, the soft middle of a bun meant for someone else. A thief's snack was rarely beautiful. It was often bruised, half smashed, already bitten by flies. But still delicious. More delicious maybe because it had been taken, because it wasn't supposed to be yours, and yet here it was, in your hand, in your mouth, in your belly. Warm, wild proof that you were still clever, still fast, still fed. Taverns, too, offered their own kind of stolen flavor, not by theft, but by timing. Bread crusts left behind by someone richer, gravy, pooled on a plate, sopped up with fingers when no one was looking. A leftover sausage cut too short to serve, passed to the boy who swept the floors. Tavern bites, not meals, not feasts, but moments, moments of flavor in a life too often tasteless. They were oily, salty, hot, burned your mouth if you weren't careful, which no one ever was. And when the cook wasn't watching, a server might tuck something into their apron. A fried root, a bit of meat wrapped in cloth. To eat later, behind the door, by candlelight. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing, only if it feels right. Stealing food didn't always mean guilt. Sometimes it meant hope. The kind of hope that says, if I can eat today, maybe I can laugh tomorrow. And sometimes people let it happen. The baker who looked away. The merchant who pretended not to notice the missing fruit, not because they approved, but because they understood. Everyone had been hungry. Everyone had once wanted just one more bite. And some things aren't worth punishing, not when the stomach growls louder than the law. Later in bed, the crumbs still on their fingers, thieves slept soundly, not out of pride, not out of shame, but out of fullness, brief but real, and in dreams they might return to that bite, that exact moment, the smell, the taste, the thrill, and they'd wake not with guilt, but with a grin. Now we follow the road, not paved, not smooth, but travelled by pilgrims, peddlers, messengers, and in their bags small salted treasures, snacks not stolen but saved, for mouths far from home. The road was never kind. It bit the soles, burned the shoulders, pressed dust into every fold of cloth and every crease of skin, and still, people walked it. Not always by choice. Some were pilgrims, others were messengers, some fled, some sought, but all of them carried food, not meals. Not feasts, just something. A bite tucked into cloth, a pouch tied with string, a waxed packet pressed into the bottom of a satchel, guarded like treasure, because the road didn't stop for hunger. And so the travelers learned, eat while walking, eat while waiting, eat while pretending you're not lost. Junk food for them meant survival. Salted meats, thin, dry, and sharp. You'd chew for minutes before it softened, but it stayed good for days, weeks even. Dried fruits, figs like leather, apples like parchment. Sweetness that stuck in the teeth and memory. Hard cheese, not the creamy kind, but the kind that snapped like wood and made you work for every crumb. Flatbread, dense, unsalted, tore like cloth, ate like rope, but it filled the stomach. And sometimes that's all you asked. Nuts rattled in bags, seeds slipped through fingers. A coin-sized cake of oats and honey might be saved for days, nibbled in slivers, because on the road you never knew when the next bite would come. You never wasted. Not a crumb, not a wrapper. Even the cloth that once held the bread might become a handkerchief, or a map, or a pillow. Sometimes the food was shared between strangers with tired eyes, between lovers walking different directions, between a child and a soldier too hungry to ask. That moment, a hand extended, a bite offered, meant more than language. It meant, I see you. I know this ache. Let's eat. And in that pause, the road softened. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. There were roadside bites too, vendors who stood at crossroads with trays of food on sticks, hot chestnuts, fried dough, a sliver of pickle offered with a wink. The weary would stop, dig through their coin pouch and buy something, not because they needed it, but because they missed the feeling of wanting something. That too was hunger. Some travelers carried herbs in pouches. They chewed mint to wake up, anise to settle their stomachs, cinnamon bark to sweeten the hours between towns, and when night came, they'd unwrap their final bite, the one they'd been saving, the thing they'd told themselves they wouldn't eat unless the day got hard, and every day. The day got hard, but the bite still felt earned, because it was theirs. They had carried it across mud, through rain, beneath sky, and now, with the stars overhead and the fire weak, they ate and remembered home, not with sadness, not always, sometimes just with softness. The road was hard, but the food reminded them they were still human. Now let us leave the dust behind and enter a quieter hunger, the hunger that never had enough. That made a meal from almost nothing, and somehow still made it good. Not every feast begins with a table. Some begin with a crumb, a smear of something fatty on old bread, a sliver of root boiled too long, a memory, salted and served, because when you have little you learn to make it feel like more. And in the medieval world, most people had very little. No silver forks, no roasted birds with crisped skin, no sauces ladled from shining pots, but they had feasts of a different kind, born of need, built with care, a crust, toasted on the fire until it browned, then dipped, just once, in the pan where stew had been. The flavor clung, and it was enough. A cabbage leaf, wilted and peppered, with vinegar, torn in two and shared. A bite of porridge stiffened from the day before, cut into squares and fried in grease. Suddenly it was something new, a meal. Feasting, then, was not about abundance. It was about invention, a trick of the senses. You layered texture, crunch from onions if you had them, softness from lentils, a pop of mustard seed hiding like a joke in the middle of the bite. You arranged things, not artfully, not really, but with care. A round of bread, a line of pickled turnip, a few nuts crushed on top, a little plate made. The scraps looked full. A bowl made the bottom feel deeper. You ate slowly, not because you weren't hungry, but because that was the point. The first bite to test, the second to savor, the third to remember. And then, it was gone. But for those few minutes it had been something more, a celebration of having, of creating, of surviving another day. Sometimes you even lit a candle. Why not? It was a feast after all. Children believed it more easily. Their eyes were wide, their stomachs louder. They saw magic in steam. They believed in dinner. So the adults did too. They leaned into the performance, the smile, the pause, the little song while stirring the pot. It helped. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. The truth was, the food didn't taste like much, but it felt like something, and sometimes that's all you need, a feeling that someone cared, that the fire was still lit, that you'd be full, even if only just enough. Feasts without feasts weren't rare, they were the norm, and they held their own kind of glory, because they were earned, through work, through patience, through quiet genius. No one wrote down these meals. There were no menus, but ask anyone what they remembered most, and they wouldn't tell you about banquets. They'd tell you about that one night, that one crust, that one bowl, when it was cold outside but warm inside, and the food was just right. Now we step into the forbidden, the secret, flavors you weren't supposed to taste, rules broken, mouths hushed, and the thrill of indulgence, quiet as sin. Not all flavors were allowed. Some were whispered, hidden behind cloaks, slipped into mouths with eyes closed, chewed in corners where no one could see. Because in the medieval world, taste had rules, rules drawn not in ink, but in belief, by priests, by kings, by seasons, by status. Some foods were forbidden. To the poor, they were unreachable. To the pious, they were sin. To some, they were irresistible. A sliver of meat during Lent, a spoon of honey before sunrise on a fast day, a bite of something roasted when only boiled was allowed. Each one tasted better, not just because of flavor, but because of danger, because you weren't supposed to, but you did. And oh, how it melted on the tongue, like truth, like rebellion. The rules were many. Meat on Fridays, no milk and meat together, never. Spiced wine in the morning, forbidden. But hunger doesn't read scripture. Cravings don't care for laws, and people found ways. A widow fed her children bacon on a Friday, praying after every bite. A priest kept sweetmeats in a locked box, insisting they were medicinal. A boy stole a sausage from a rich man's table and shared it with a dog beneath the stairs. The forbidden wasn't always about religion. Sometimes it was about class. Saffron was for nobles, sugar was for the court. But a baker just once slipped both into a roll. He didn't tell anyone, he just smiled as he ate. Slowly, some flavors were illegal in silence. A woman of the village might buy wine, with her own coin, drinking in secret what men drank in the open. A servant might nibble the rind of cheese meant for his master. Was it theft? Maybe, but it was also existence, claiming a piece of a world that said you didn't belong, and in every forbidden flavor. Freedom, brief, salty, sweet, like licking sugar from your thumb while hiding behind a stable. If you're enjoying this pace, already leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Some said the soul would suffer, that the body must be punished to remain pure, but not everyone agreed. Some believed that a little pleasure, taken quietly, could soothe the spirit more than 100 prayers. They ate what they shouldn't, and then they smiled, not because they were proud, but because they were alive. The most daring meals were the smallest. Not feasts, not banquets, just a bite, a taste, a memory made of pepper and risk, and afterward, a silence, a breath, and the knowledge that the world had not ended, that God perhaps would understand, that hunger sometimes wins, and that's okay. Now let us return to something slower, simpler. Ritual, not rebellion, where even the greasiest bite had grace shared quiet, a choreography of crumbs and kindness. Some foods glisten not from glaze or sugar, but from grease, the kind that seeps into cloth. That stains fingers, that pools on wooden plates like melted gold. In the medieval world, grease meant flavor, meant warmth, meant something richer than you probably deserved. And when you had it, when the food crackled, dripped, shimmered, you didn't waste a drop. You wiped your fingers on your apron, yes, but only after you licked them, and you shared. Not always because you wanted to, but because you had to, because someone else was watching, and the world would feel wrong if you didn't offer them a bite. So you tore it in two, the fried fritter, the oily bread, the pastry that left a shine on your thumb, half for you, half for them, no need to ask. The ritual was known, grease and grace, side by side, a quiet choreography, a bite passed without words, a nod, a glance, a moment suspended between hunger and humility. Food like this wasn't clean. It dripped, it crumbled. It left behind a trail, on your hands, your lips, your memory, but it made you feel full briefly, beautifully. The best bites were never planned, a corner of something handed to you unexpectedly, a finger dipped into gravy, a crust soaked in broth. Still warm, even in the filthiest tavern, there was a kind of grace. People passed plates, wiped spoons, used sleeves when napkins failed. They laughed when the oil hit their chin. They didn't apologize, because eating was sacred, and greasy food especially asked for nothing but presence. No pretending, no ceremony, just chewing and joy. The older folks remembered the meals that left marks, the stains on their cuffs, the prints on parchment, the scent that lingered, long after the food was gone. Not shameful, just real. Grease meant richness, and richness meant memory. You'd remember that roll, that turnip fried in lard, that pancake that folded in your hand and refused to stay neat, and you'd remember who you ate it with, because grease demands closeness. One plate. 2 hands, 3 bites, then nothing left, and everyone satisfied. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Even the cleanup had rhythm. Hands wiped on thighs, plates licked, ashes tossed into the fire to catch the last. Drops, no scolding, just acceptance. This was food, real food. That gave more than it took, even if it left you shiny, and when the fire dimmed and the room fell quiet and the belly was warm, you smiled because you'd eaten. Not properly, not perfectly, but honestly. Now let us end where the smallest bite holds the biggest meaning. A crumb. A crust. Our token, not of hunger but of dignity. There is something sacred about the last bite, not the first. The first is hunger, but the last, that is dignity. Because even in a world built on lack, where meals were thin and time was thinner, people held on to one thing, the right to feel full, even if it was only for a moment. And sometimes that feeling came in the smallest shape, a crust hidden under a cloth, a sugared nut wrapped in linen, a single drop of honey saved at the bottom of a jar. These were not scraps, they were treasures, and they were kept not because they filled the belly, but because they meant something else entirely. They meant, I matter, that this matters, that the world has taken many things, but not my taste, not my choice, not my small ritual of pleasure. A crumb could do that, a single, deliberate, well-earned crumb, held in the palm, eaten with care. People saved their favorites for last, not out of gluttony, out of grace. They knew the meal would end, they knew the work would resume, they knew the cold was waiting, but for now, just this, one more bite. Perfect in its imperfection. The old man who kept a bit of apple in his pocket all day, the mother who tucked half a honey cake behind a jar so her children wouldn't eat it before she got her turn, the girl who saved the last roasted seed to eat while staring at the fire. Not indulgent, not excessive, just human. This was the feast, not the food, but the choosing, the savoring, the whisper to the world that said, I still know how to enjoy something. And that, especially for the poor, the overlooked, the constantly in motion, was everything. Sometimes, food was eaten in shame, too fast, too messy, too little. But sometimes, on the right night, by the right fire, in the right silence, food became a kind of pride. The plate might be cracked, the spoon might be wood, dark with use. But the moment was yours, and in that moment the world did not own you. You did. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Even crumbs were curated, saved for guests, offered to elders, shared with care. A last crust could be broken between two people and mean more than words. A sip of wine, poured carefully, despite how little remained, could turn a night into a memory, not because of what was consumed, but because of how it felt. The dignity of food had nothing to do with portion size. It had to do with presence, with noticing the smell, with feeling the warmth, with choosing your own bite, even if it was the last one, even if it was the only one. You didn't need a feast to feel rich. You needed a pause, a crust, a candle, a crumb of something golden in a life mostly grey, and people did this, everywhere, through plagues, through frost, through war and ruin and silence. They still wrapped their last bit of bread in a cloth, still offered the softer half of a root to someone they loved, still smiled at the smell of garlic, still remembered how to say thank you with food, even if the words weren't spoken, even if the thank you was just the silence between two chews. Now, as we step out of this world of forgotten bites, we carry one thing with us. That junk food, this so-called food of the streets and stalls, was never really junk. It was joy, wrapped in grease, soaked in vinegar, salted and sweetened and sometimes stolen, but always, always dignified, because it was chosen, because it was felt, because it reminded people that they still had the right to pleasure, however small, however fleeting, and that is worth remembering. Now we turn to the final chapter. Not a bite, not a sip, but a memory, soft as ash, sweet as sighs. Somewhere in the quiet after the fires have burned low and the streets have emptied of footsteps and voices, there lingers the scent of something sweet. It's faint, just a whisper of spice in the air. A trace of honey, a ghost of grease, that's all that's left now, but once it was everything. A roasted chestnut in cold fingers, a pie warm from a vendor's cart, passed hand to hand like treasure, a sugared almond cracked between teeth, its flavor unfolding like memory. This was medieval junk food, and it was never junk, because what they ate in secret, or in celebration, or in silence, those stolen bites, shared crusts, fried indulgences, were pieces of something deeper. They were hope. Hope in a world where survival was not promised, where work was long, where hunger was a constant drumbeat beneath daily life. And yet, someone still fried a fritter, still dipped a root in honey, still dared to use a spice that traveled oceans to arrive in a peasant's hand. These were not the foods of kings, but they were still royal, not in cost, not in grandeur, but in what they meant, a taste of joy, a reminder that even in mud and straw and cold and toil, pleasure still had a place. You see, sweetness doesn't belong only to luxury. It belongs to longing, to the part of us that says, quietly, in the darkest part of winter, I want something more. And sometimes more came not in abundance, but in the smallest things. A slice of fried bread, a sip of something fermented, a candied fruit saved from a festival and eaten by firelight a week later, just to remember what joy had felt like. They didn't have snacks the way we do, no wrappers, no shelves, but they had cravings. They had the same midnight hunger, the same tug in the belly and the soul that asked for comfort, and they answered it with what they had. Grease, salt, sugar when possible, fat when lucky, spices, stolen or gifted or traded for flavor in whatever form it came, and with it came ritual, the shared bite, the candle lit before chewing, the silence that followed a particularly good mouthful. And they remembered those bites, not because they were many, but because they were few, rare, sacred. We remember too, even now in our world of abundance and noise and packaging and plenty, we still lean back at the end of a long day and reach for a treat, not because we're hungry, but because we're human, and something in us remembers that food isn't just fuel, it's feeling. its memory, its defiance, its survival, and that last sweet bite, that final taste at the bottom of the bowl, or the crumb on the tongue just before bed. That is where the story ends, quietly, deliciously, with nothing left on the plate but contentment, with nothing in the air but the echo of flavor, with nothing in your heart but the warmth of having had something just for you. The camera pulls back now. We leave the kitchen. We leave the markets and the carts and the sellers. We leave the stained aprons and the whispered bites. We leave behind the hands that made and passed and shared, and we carry forward the sweetness, because sometimes what they left behind wasn't a monument or a manuscript, but a recipe, a scent, a method of frying, a way of smiling when the batter bubbles right. And that's enough. That's more than enough.